everyone to this first in our new Children's Policy Centre webinar series, In Conversation with Commissioners. I'm Sharon Bessell. I'm Professor here at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, and I'm also Director of the Children's Policy Centre. I'm in the southern part of Canberra on Ngunnawal land. This land has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people who might be joining us on this webinar this evening in Australia and this morning in Scotland. The Children's Policy Centre is based at the Australian National University, and we have three key objectives. First is to undertake innovative, interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second is to seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners working on a range of issues relating to the human rights, well-being and best interests of children. And third, we aim to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and for young people. As I said, this is a new webinar series. It began with the idea of a webinar or two where we had a panel with some of Australia's commissioners, but it very quickly grew into something far bigger and far more exciting. Over the next 3 months, we will have 6 more conversations with commissioners from around Australia. And in February next year, we will recommence and continue the conversations with commissioners from around Australia and from around the world. And into next year, we will also be inviting children and young people who are part of commissioners' advisory groups and who are so critical to better outcomes for all in terms of human rights and wellbeing to join these conversations. And you can find information and registration information for the other webinars on our website, and that's going to be in the chat in just a minute. Today, I am absolutely delighted to welcome our first guest in these conversations, Bruce Adamson. Bruce is as I think everyone here knows, Bruce is the Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland, and he has been since 2017. During Bruce's tenure, Scotland has become a world leader in promoting the human rights of children and young people and in ensuring that children and young people are at the centre of discussions and decision making. Bruce is a lawyer by trade with over 20 years' experience in human rights in particular. He's acted as an international expert for a range of international institutions, including the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the European Union, OSCE and the World Health Organization, and he's currently chair of the European Network of Ombudsmen for Children. So Bruce, it's so good to have you today for the first of these conversations. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Bessell, for that fantastic welcome. And again, let me start by thanking again the First Nations peoples of Australia and all of you for this very warm welcome, albeit that I'm standing here in Edinburgh rather than with you there in Canberra.
It's so good to have you with us. And I wanted to begin with an issue that so many of us around the world have looked at with what I think I could well describe as excitement and awe, and that is the incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scottish law. And I think here in Australia, we're still some distance from that. But can we begin by you explaining to us just how important that development has been in the lives of children and young people in Scotland?
It's the biggest and most important thing that we can do in legal terms to ensure that children's rights are respected, protected and fulfilled. I think it's the biggest thing and most important thing that the Scottish Parliament's done since it was created in the late 1990s. And it comes on the back of decades of campaigning from children and young people and commissioners and civil society to get us to this stage. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge that this has been a process led by children and young people calling for their rights to be better protected in law. Like Australia and other countries, we don't have a constitutional system here in Scotland and the UK where international obligations automatically become part of law as a matter of constitution. We require domestic legislation to make that real. But obviously the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as Australia's done, as the UK's done and applies in Scotland, was 30 years ago. And the government's consistent position since then has been that a number of pieces of legislation around housing and healthcare are the way in which human rights and children's rights are implemented in domestic law. I don't think that that's good enough. I don't think it's strong enough. And so we've been campaigning for a long time on this. When I came into office 4.5 years ago, the government was still opposed to it, but the kind of door was starting to be opened. And we've actually made surprising progress, I would say. It's come as a surprise to me at various stages. When the government moved, each time we've pushed for a bit more and the government's moved with us. So that's been very exciting. But even in 2017, they were opposed. In 2018, they opened the door to maybe doing it, but had suggested it would be a long-term process whereby it would be part of a constitutionalization of rights in Scotland that may take some years, and cherry-picking rights. And it was very much our youth parliament, our children's parliament, and young people really demanding that we had full and direct incorporation within the last session of parliament. And we were able to call on a number of international experts to help us. We drafted our own bill and gave it to government to try and prompt further progress. But it really has been about challenging and pushing government throughout. And I'm really pleased that we got to a stage where the Parliament unanimously passed that legislation at the beginning of this year. Unfortunately, it's now been subject to a Supreme Court challenge by the UK government, and we're awaiting that judgment. But in any case, what we do have is unanimous support across the Scottish Parliament for an incorporation bill.
Bruce, I should have said to the people who've joined us on the webinar at the beginning that I have a number of questions, in fact about 500 that I wanted to ask you, but I've whittled them right back. But we will leave time at the end for others to ask some questions and to join the conversation. So if people have comments and would like to, or questions and would like to put them in the Q&A, feel free, but we'll also have some time for people to ask questions towards the end. But Bruce, following on from that, one of the things that I found really interesting was that the legislation requires Scottish ministers to carry out a child rights and wellbeing impact assessment in respect to provisions of primary and secondary legislation and around certain decisions of a strategic nature that relate to the rights and the wellbeing of children. Now I understand the Scottish Government has been preparing those impact statements since around 2015, but they've not been required under legislation, which they now are. Can you talk us through what those impact assessments look like? What is it that they take into account when they're being done?
I think this is really important, and the Office of the Commissioner here in Scotland has been working on impact assessments from the very early days. The first commissioner was doing some work around it, so it's something fairly familiar in Scotland, the use of impact assessments, and certainly since around 2014 there's been more children's rights and well-being. The government kind of adds in that concept, impact assessments. The bill will make that, as you say, compulsory in a lot more circumstances. They're not great, to be honest, and I'm not giving anything away by saying that there's still a lot to do in terms of making them a really useful tool. So the problem that we've got at the moment is they do tend to be quite bureaucratic. They tend to be fairly basic. They're not done on a broad range. So we still haven't delivered the culture change within decision making that the use of impact assessments is actually a really valuable tool. They still are fairly bureaucratic. There are some good practice coming through. That's why the European Network of Ombudspersons for Children, which I'm currently chairing, which is 43 members across wider Europe, we chose that as our thematic issue last year, pre-COVID, because one of the issues that we saw across Europe was a growing understanding and desire by decision makers to take a rights-based approach, but a real lack of kind of tools and capacity to do so. And so at the European level, we developed a common framework of reference around what impact assessment should look like, and brought together quite a lot of good practice from across Europe. And we've been applying that in Scotland now and working with government and local authorities, because we want to see this at local decision making as well, to try and get impact assessments more used. But real challenges, particularly in relation to involving children and young people in that process, awareness and knowledge around children's rights and the broader human rights framework, and still probably a way to go in convincing people of the usefulness of it. And so one of the key thrusts has been seeing this as an essential part of legitimate decision making in order to evidence that you've gone through a process of actually thinking about children's rights, and so it actually being a really positive and useful tool to do your job better, rather than kind of a bureaucratic tick box exercise. And I think we've probably got a bit to go in terms of that cultural change, but we're hoping that by legislating to require it, that'll help trigger some of that cultural change.
And some of these things do take time to evolve, because, as you say, it is about attitudinal and cultural change, not just about having the requirement in place. In 2019, one of the things that happened in Scotland that I think was also quite exciting for many people around the world was the passing of the Children Equal Protection from Assault Act. And so previously, all adults in Scotland were legally protected from all forms of physical violence and assault, but there was still a defence available for the physical assault of children if it was seen to be exercised as for the purposes of punishment. And of course, this is a global issue, and in many countries, physical violence is allowed against children as part of punishment. And I always think about, when I think about this issue, think of some research I was involved in some years ago as part of the UN Secretary General study of violence against children. And a little girl, which was in Vietnam, drew a picture of her mother's hands. And what she said was, "I love it when my mummy uses her hands to cuddle me. I hate it when she uses them to hit me." And for adults, I think that tension often just isn't apparent. And the efforts to ban the physical punishment of children have often been seen as intervening or as kind of the state intervening inappropriately, or impinging on parents' rights, or sometimes even teachers' rights. Can you talk us through a little bit about what's happened with that law change in Scotland, and whether it started to bring about a change in both behaviour, but also, as we were just saying, a change in attitudes? Or did those changes precede the law?
I think that's a really interesting one when we look internationally at kind of when countries have brought in the legislation. I was involved a little bit with the New Zealand legislation, which was brought in very strongly against public opinion. That hasn't really been the case in Scotland, because we're one of the last countries in Europe to bring in this legislation, the first in the UK, but last in Europe. And I think that attitudes had been changing already. The government's position had been that because attitudes were starting to change, they wanted to take a kind of a public health type approach, but didn't want to legislate for fear exactly of that sense that government interference. And so again, when I came into office 4.5 years ago, the early conversations I had with government was being very clear that position was not acceptable to me, and that allowing the assault of children for the purpose of punishment should never be lawful. Because it sets the idea that violence is an appropriate response to behaviour, and we should never legalise violence towards children in any sense, because that tolerance, and again, so much of that came out of the great work that you and others did with the global study. The UN, the Council of Europe, the European Union, which we were part of at the beginning of this process, had all said very, very clearly that comprehensive protection against assault was necessary. The government in the UK has got a really poor record on this in European terms, and has been consistently condemned in terms of corporal punishment and judgment since the 1970s. Scotland and the UK kind of last places to allow things like caning in schools, the use of implements, and had to be really pushed. And I think that was probably true here. It was an opposition, a Green member of Parliament, whose legislation it was that achieved this. The government did eventually support it, but only after it was clear that all of the opposition parties, including the more conservative elements of Parliament, were actually looking to support it. And also after I'd threatened to take strategic litigation on the issue, because I felt that it breached the European Convention, which was already part of our on human rights, which is already part of our domestic law. So that's the kind of hard element of it. But what was really interesting, I think, was the civil society and children and young people kind of movement that really changed hearts and minds, I think. And the fact that we were able to actually get the media on side and faith groups on side. And that was really strongly based on parenting groups taking a really strong lead, presenting the evidence very strongly about the psychological impacts, presenting evidence very strongly about the way in which children felt and the need to focus on positive parenting. So it was actually a very positive campaign, albeit that I was having some more robust discussions with government directly, but the campaign was really positive. And the fact that everyone else in Europe, including near neighbours like Ireland, had already gone further, made it a bit easier. Wales is now following suit. But the key part of it, I think, was that it was parents groups that were leading it, it was children that were leading it, faith groups that were leading it, and that they were presenting that evidence really strongly, that there were better ways. And this wasn't about state interference, but rather protecting children in the same way we're all protected from the use of violence to impact on our behaviour.
I think that broad-based campaign, that broad-based approach and bringing people on to look at how this can be positive change is just so important. And I always think when we sometimes see debates in Australia and elsewhere about the value of children's rights and the value of the convention, I always think the convention itself is actually one of the most powerful tools that parents can use to advocate on behalf of and with their children. And I think when we start to frame this conversation in that way, it becomes so much more positive. Bruce, I'm kind of jumping around all over the place in the issues that I'm raising because I want to cover some of the issues that you've kind of led change on. And I wanted to talk a little bit about out-of-home care. And I've done some research in Australia on children's experiences of out-of-home care. And one of the issues that so often comes up is the pain that children and young people talk about when they're separated from their brothers and sisters. And that issue of sibling contact is on one where there has been discussion and change in Scotland. Can you share with us what some of those changes have been and what it means for young people and children who are in care?
Yeah. This was one of the biggest issues that care experienced children and young people raised with me right from day one in office. And it links to some work that we did with the Independent Care Review, which I partly co-chaired, which is a massive kind of root and branch review of the care system, which we're taking forward. But the sibling contact element was something that was very much kind of accelerated. It's gone at a much faster pace, and there's a brilliant campaigning group, Stand Up for Siblings, which involves kind of law centres and children's groups, and very much led by care experienced young people. And it's exactly that point that you make, that family, and again, the preamble to the convention talks about growing up in a family environment of happiness and love and understanding, and so much of the convention's built around the importance of parents, but also of family and identity. And for so many care experienced young people, that's the thing that's taken away from them, and that's so important. So the legal change that we've been able to secure, which has now recently come into force, requires all decision-making bodies to give specific consideration to sibling contact and sibling relationships. Our legislation previously had focused on parental relationships, but hadn't given that same consideration to sibling contact, which is hugely important. So effectively, it's treated sibling relationships in a fairly similar way to parental relationships, in terms of every decision-making body having to actually demonstrate how they've taken the child's view into account in relation to what decisions should take place on sibling contact, and also, where appropriate, actually involved those siblings in decision making too. So it gives, and we know that that's so important for care experienced young people, their younger siblings as well, and who they've taken on a caring role perhaps for. And so that's really important, that that older siblings now have more say in decision making in relation to younger siblings as well.
I think that's just so important in terms of understanding too the importance of the breadth of relationships that children have, that it's not just a child-parent relationship, important as that is, but it's about this web of networks and relationships that children have and value so deeply.
And one other thing that I think is really important that came out of those discussions, kind of the definition of kind of sibling and family. And for so many care experienced young people, those aren't necessarily blood relationships. And so allowing children to describe what their kind of familial relationships are and who's important to them is really essential, and shouldn't be defined simply on kind of legal definitions or blood relationships, but rather based on how the child sees themselves and who they see as important in making decisions in their best interest.
It's so important, and it goes so powerfully to respecting the dignity of the child. And so important, in Australia, as in many other countries, so many children who are in care are First Nations children. And so I think the understanding, the complexity and the nature of relationships is so fundamentally important. One of the issues on which there has been an ongoing campaign for some time in Australia has been called Raise the Age, and that's been calling on state and territory governments across the country to increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility, or the age at which children can both understand their actions and also be held criminally responsible, including in Australia being committed to juvenile detention for often long periods of time. The international recommendation for minimum age of criminal responsibility is 14. In Australia, it's 10. I think in 2019, the Scottish Parliament passed a law to increase the age to 12, but is yet to bring that into force, and it's at 8. I think, Bruce, I've got a two-part question here. One is technical and one is attitudinal. Can you explain the distinction between prosecution and arrest and charge, as those things currently play out in Scotland, and how that matters? And second, why, based on Scotland's experience, has it proven so difficult in so many countries to get an increase in that minimum age for criminal responsibility?
Yeah, this is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and probably my biggest failure, I think, over the last 4.5 years is that we've only managed to get legislation shifted to 12, despite kind of all of our efforts. And so the age of criminal responsibility still is 8 in Scotland. We've got an age of prosecution which is set at 12, but children between 8 and 12 can still be arrested and referred into our children's hearing system on offence grounds. And so they are still technically offences, and they move into a children's welfare-based system, but they can't be prosecuted below the age of 12. But the charge element of it, particularly with referrals, offence referrals to the children's hearing system, means that those things do become the part of the record, but also very much part of how children identify and understand their own self and behaviour, that label of criminalisation or offending at a very, very young age. We know from all of the work that we've done with children and young people has an incredibly stigmatising effect. And so when we're talking about harmful behaviour from children, criminalising that and labelling that as bad is incredibly stigmatizing, and actually links to much higher chances of further harmful behavior. And I think that's really something that's at the heart of this, is that it's not about ignoring harmful behavior from children. It's about the most appropriate way of ensuring that behavior is supported, seeing children as children in the first instance. But why do I think it's been so difficult? I think this is something that really worries me in terms of societal attitudes, and I think this doesn't gel at all with our approach to children's rights. And the first Children's Commissioner, Kathleen Marshall, always used to talk about, we see kind of children as angels or demons, and so children are either these things that we need to kind of protect and wrap in cotton wool and look after, or kind of young thugs and that children are dangerous, and neither of these things are the approach that a rights-based approach should be, seeing children as active parts of our community and with agency and able to contribute, but entitled to special protection, including protection against criminalisation. What really played out very strongly in Scotland, where we've got an age still of 8, only moving to 12, was real concern from the government in relation to criminal justice and being seen on kind of soft on criminal justice. What about the case where a young person violently harms another person, death and sexual harm, all of those things? How do we deal with that when society strongly demands that we take punitive punishment action? And I think that's exactly the wrong way of looking at it. And because all of the studies, and there's a great study done in Edinburgh on youth and transitional justice, big longitudinal study looking at children and their engagement with criminal justice mechanisms, but all of the international evidence shows very clearly that a criminal justice approach to that harmful behaviour gives the worst possible outcome, not only for the individual, but for the community. It leads to a much higher likelihood of further harmful behavior, and that's not good for those that are subject to that harmful behavior, victims either. And so we've really struggled to crack that. And so even though in Europe, the Council of Europe very strongly had called for a very long time for an age of at least 14, the UN committee had the age through concluding observations on countries, had long established the idea that it should be 14 or higher and pointed to higher ages. Unfortunately, the government here relied on the outdated General Comment number 10, which had referred to the age of 12, and tried to argue that was the international standard, which I objected to very strongly. And we had members of the UN committee, including Anne Skelton, directly engage with it. We had Dunja Mijatovic, who's the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights, directly engage. This is probably one of the only examples I can think of where international bodies proactively engaged in Scotland. This isn't a country which the International Human Rights Committee generally kind of comes and proactively gets involved. This is the one of the only examples I can think of outside the kind of planned regular assessments where the European and international communities were so concerned at the approach that Scotland was taking, but still we weren't able to convince government or parliament to go beyond 12. There is a commitment within the legislation that there'll be a review in 3 years' time, but it was pretty depressing, because I think anyone who saw the evidence to Parliament, which included many young people, including care experienced young people, talking about their experiences of being criminalised, I don't think anyone who saw that evidence could have taken the view that an age of criminal responsibility at 12 was in any way appropriate. Yet the political pressure felt by parliamentarians meant that they've left us there. So that's probably my biggest kind of failure. I'm very pleased about physical punishment and incorporation, but age of criminal responsibility, I think is we're in a really disgraceful position in Scotland, and it's totally out of step with all of our commitments to children's rights to have the idea that at the age of 8 or even at the age of 12, that the criminal law is the appropriate response to a child's harmful behaviour. Sorry, I can rant on all this all night, but I know we need to.
I think there are a lot of people here who'd like to hear you continue talking about it. It's certainly been an issue on which there has been so much attention in Australia. And of course, it's one where we see all of those patterns of discrimination and structural barriers that hold some people in certain places in society, playing out and sort of putting barriers up to children before they've even reached an age where they've had, what Australians would like to call a fair go at life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I gave an interview just a few days ago to the Police Federation, the union that represents police officers in Scotland. And again, they had some real concerns about raising the age of criminal responsibility throughout the debates in Parliament. But this was a really interesting discussion with police officers around their experience. And so much of the focus is on what do we do when we're in the situation where a child is obviously in distress and is displaying that distress in a harmful way. What do we do? And I think that strong focus on putting in resourcing and support to take a welfare-based approach, and the important work that's being done, I know in Australia, but here in Scotland as well, in support a family-based approach, a whole systems-based approach, getting support in and around families to make sure that children aren't put in a position where their distress is creating harm in others.
Bruce, I think in some ways this leads on to the next issue that I wanted to talk through with you. And child poverty remains such a huge problem globally, and this is where we see those structural issues, those patterns of discrimination playing out so powerfully. Globally, more children than adults live in multi-dimensional poverty, at least based on Oxford University's age disaggregated analysis of the multi-dimensional poverty index. Our work here at the Children's Policy Centre in Australia and around the region has demonstrated the terrible impacts that poverty has on children, not just in terms of income and material basics, but right across their lives. And of course, it's been something that there's been a real focus of concern on across the UK, particularly given some of the quite punitive welfare measures that you have, that we also have here in Australia. You've described child poverty as the biggest human rights issue facing children and young people in Scotland, or one of the biggest issues. And I'd say that's also true here in Australia, particularly as a result of COVID-19 and the lockdowns and all that goes with that. How can we rethink child poverty and then begin to address it from a human rights perspective in a way that starts to really shift some of these structural things? That's a big question, I know, but I'd love to hear your thinking around it.
No, it's a big question, and again, huge credit to the impressive work that you've been doing on this issue, and particularly around the multidimensional elements. And again, I think this is where so much attention needs to be globally, and I'm glad that, again, a recent UNICEF report on it, which I found quite useful. Yeah, this is the thing that constantly makes me angriest, to be honest, because I think as Philip Alston, who was the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, a proud Australian, said when he came to the UK and did his mission, and again, when you've got the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty coming to a rich country like the UK and really pointing out the huge failures and pointing out that poverty is a political choice in the UK and Scotland. And the fact that our child poverty levels sit so high, depending on the different measures, but it's a quarter of our children are in poverty, and that's not being able to get enough food to eat, not having a safe, warm home to live in, not being able to access kind of socialization and full enjoyment of education. That is criminal. I mean, that is something that should never be allowed to happen, but is getting worse. And as you've said, has been made worse through COVID, and it's exacerbated the existing issues in terms of those whose rights were already most at risk. And so it's had this disproportionate effect on disabled children, on young carers, on care experience. There's a strong gendered element to it as well in terms of the vast majority here, and I'm sure there, of single parent households are led by women. And all of the effects of COVID have had this disproportionate impact on all of the groups whose rights were already most at risk, and we're not putting in place the things that we need to address that. Part of it where I thought we were having some success, and I thought was interesting in Scotland, playing out very differently from England in the media, starting to be able to convince through kind of public campaigning, and we've got amazing civil society here, as you do there, doing a lot of media campaigning around poverty and framing it as a human rights issue. And I think that's got to be the starting point, is reframing poverty as a human rights issue. This isn't kind of dole bludging kind of this isn't people that are spending the money on inappropriate things. This is about the basic building blocks of a society, and children's rights, everybody's rights, but particularly for children to have an adequate standard of living. Adequate standard of living. This is not aiming for the stars. How can we argue that children shouldn't have an adequate standard of living, have the right to goods, physical and mental health through having nutritious foods, and the right to social security as well. So I think framing some of these things in the media, I think, is really important to start to change the public narrative. And I think we've actually been quite successful in that in Scotland. And a lot of the discussion during COVID has been very interesting, as more and more people have experienced poverty, perhaps for the first time, and attitudes towards the use of social security to support people have changed. Unfortunately, I think that as we move through COVID, there's a real risk that we go back to the old ways of thinking. And so a big part of my focus at the moment is to really try and capture some of that kind of public narrative and put the political pressure on. And there's strong campaigns at the moment to combat some of the really reprehensible decisions by the UK government to really attack beneficiaries, particularly those most at risk. And the Scottish government's use of its own powers to mitigate some of that, but to go nowhere near far enough. And so I think changing that public narrative is really important. And then a lot of the things that, again, you're focused on in your work around income security, around relationship focus, looking at taking a more holistic view. But a big part of it's getting money into families. A big part of it's then ensuring that kind of relationship based support for children and young people to allow them to access education and socialization and the broader rights framework, and creating kind of good employment. Because one of the things in Scotland, as probably is in Australia as well, is that so much of our poverty is in work poverty, and it really challenges that narrative that this is about people that don't want to work. It's not that, it's that wages are too low, job insecurity. And one of the things that may be different between Scotland and Australia, it's certainly different in New Zealand, where we didn't get school meals in New Zealand, we had packed lunches. In Scotland, we've got a system of school meals, and schools have actually played a really important role in combating poverty, because free school meals are available to all children now up to primary 3, but for children on low incomes, school was a place where you could get breakfast and lunch and often dinner as well. When we closed the schools during COVID, that created a huge problem, because schools were one of the main ways we dealt with food insecurity for school-age children and children in schools. And so that's really challenged, I think, some of the kind of preconceptions here, that it's all right because we've got free school meals. It's like, actually, for those that aren't in school, or if schools are closed, how do you get food to families? And holiday hunger was probably one of the most shocking things when I came into office. I started a couple of months before our big summer holidays, and then I spent that summer holidays traveling around Scotland and just seeing how difficult it was for families to support children over those holidays, and all of the impacts on mental and physical health, and all of the kind of compounding pressure that they put on families. And so community-based responses, food security, housing security, we need to see human rights as a poverty as a human rights issue. Again, this is an issue I'm very passionate about, but I think that the work that you and others are doing in terms of looking at what the kind of indicators framework is, and looking at kind of the different ways in which we can put the supports around families and children, are absolutely essential, as well as getting this kind of public narrative around addressing poverty as an important social good.
Bruce, I've got another couple of one or two more questions that I'd like to ask, but just so we'll then open up to questions that others might have. So people may want to start thinking about a question if they would like, and pop it into the Q&A. I can either read it out, or I can throw to people to ask their questions themselves. I did want to ask Bruce about climate change, and when we think about the biggest human rights issues that are facing children and young people, and one of the biggest issues of intergenerational equity that we have ever seen, I think, is, climate emergency is right up there. And for children and young people, this is something that is beyond deep concern. It's often just preoccupying their thoughts about the present and the future. You've spoken about this as climate justice. Can you tell us a little bit about the way you're approaching this, and also how children and young people in Scotland are leading some of those calls for action?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think pre-COVID, this was really clear that there were 3 issues that always came up with children and young people. One was poverty, as we've discussed, one was mental health, and one was climate justice. Consistently, every age group, every part of the country, these were things that came up really, really strongly. And climate justice is one of those things where I think it's probably clearest in human rights terms, where children and young people are playing the role of human rights defenders and environmental defenders, and really challenging adults to do things differently, that they aren't content, quite rightly, to kind of take a kind of participative approach, being part of the adult processes. And most other human rights issues that I think we deal with, children are very kind of happy and keen to engage with the adult processes. Climate justice is the one where the adult decision makers are so far away from what children and young people demand that we do, that it's become a place where human rights defenders are most obvious. Child human rights defenders are most obvious, although they exist across all elements of children's rights. And so that's been a big part of my focus, has been around focusing on the children as human rights defenders element of it. It was the day of general discussion at the UN committee back in 2018, and kind of building around that, saying that the most important thing I can do is to help create the space for young human rights defenders and climate defenders to have the tools and knowledge that they need, but also the protection, because we've now got children going into spaces where they're hostile with where decision makers are, and there's a lot of risks that come along with that, both online and in the real world, as in the physical world. And so a lot of my focus has been around helping and building the framework around child human rights defenders, rather than getting into the arguments around why climate justice is such an important human rights issue, because there's other people who are very well qualified to speak to that. And what's been really interesting over COVID is some of the frustration, quite justifiably, from children, in terms of saying, everyone's forgotten about climate justice, because the whole world's focused over the last 18 months on this huge public health and threat to life that we've got. Understandable. That's allowed people to get away with not focusing on the urgency of climate justice. And I think the attention's starting to come back to that, but a lot of children are quite rightly very concerned that this was kind of brushed under the carpet a bit over the last 18 months. We've got the COP26, the next big international climate summit, is happening in Glasgow in a few weeks' time. And obviously that will be a focus of attention. It's during COVID. We're working very closely with young human rights defenders to make sure that their actions will be safe in the context of that. But that's just a point in time. It's just one event. And I think what's really important is that we recognize the urgency of this, and that we make sure that children's voices are much more part of decision making, because what's really clear, I think more so than anything else, is there's a real intergenerational gap on this. On most other issues, on kind of mental health and poverty, there's a lot of complementarity between what we're all thinking. But on this, there's a really stark generational difference, and that's why children's voices need to be so prominent, and why they are so prominent in some of this debate. But that also has to lead to change. It can't just be us celebrating the fact that children are so passionate. It's got to be a recognition that their demands for change have to be met with appropriate responses.
Bruce, there's a question in the Q&A from Linda Savage, who asks what your opinion is of the Wellbeing of the Future Generations Wales Act of 2015.
Yeah, so this is something really interesting, and so they've got a Future Generations Commissioner and a plan in relation to future generations. Sally Holland, who's the Children's Commissioner in Wales, works very closely with the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, and there's also a proposal in Scotland. Our government's proposing to follow the Welsh model. Scotland and Wales tend to compete quite a lot on these things. If one of us is thinking about something, we're generally the others is trying to do it. So it's a very live debate here. I think having a focus on future generations is really important. I think it links very closely to some of the environmental concerns, and we see internationally sometimes with kind of commissioners for the environment, or commissioners for Mother Earth, and some of those types of things as well. I think it's very useful. I think one of the challenges is, in terms of the rights framework from which we work, there isn't that same kind of rights framework in terms of future generations. And so one of the important things for me is that we take a rights-based approach to those discussions, and particularly that we involve children and young people at the centre of those discussions. So it's a bit of a live debate here in Scotland about what our approach will be, but certainly the feedback and discussions I've had with Sally is that she thinks that the model in Wales is working really well. And there's a lot of complementarity between her work as Children's Commissioner and the Commissioner for Future Generations.
I'm just looking at the Q&A, and there's nothing else in there at the moment. I hope it's just not my technical incompetence in not seeing people's questions, but I might take the opportunity to just stick in another question. Yeah. And we've talked quite a bit, Bruce, around the importance of legislative reform and what that can deliver, and also a little around what the challenges are. But of course, on a day-to-day basis, it's relationships and inclusion that impact directly on children and young people's lives. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can ensure that children and young people are fully included in their communities, and that their views and their experiences are actively sought and respected in that kind of day-to-day way, perhaps without kind of making the point, now we need to listen to children's voices, but actually seeing children as full members of our community. You know, how to start to do that?
Yeah, I think this cuts right to the heart of the work that we're doing. I'm a lawyer by background, and I tend to like to use the law as a tool for change. But I think one of the interesting things at the big debates that we had around our incorporation bill, and the my starting point had been, we'll have a kind of pure incorporation, and that will require people to take a rights-based approach. But also within our bill, colleagues convinced me that you put in the proactive requirements for participation, consultation, action plans, impact assessments, and you provide the tools as well to help people do it, rather than just requiring people to comply. And I think some of that cultural change is what we've seen, particularly in countries that have incorporated the UNCRC more fully than we have. It's that cultural change that's really important that you get over time. Scotland, I think, has got a really good history over the last kind of 20 or 30 years of doing some exceptional work in children's participation. Civil society has been amazing. One of the things that has been stark is, as soon as COVID came along, all of that disappeared. So while we had lots of ways in which children and young people were involved in decision making, all of that stopped during COVID. And that worries me, because I think we were probably patting ourselves on the back quite a lot, and we have lots of mechanisms for involving children and young people. But it turns out it was probably a bit more tokenistic than we realized. And so a lot of the work now is trying to embed that. I think the key things are making sure that we see children's involvement as being across every aspect of their lives, not just things we see as children's issues. And I think, yeah, getting children involved in planning and transport and budgeting is really effective, because that it's spaces where you wouldn't think about children. And so that I think it's easier to actually get them to, if you're sitting around with a group of planners and you bring children in, that actually kind of works better sometimes than if you get a group of teachers perhaps. And I think getting children into some of those spaces that we wouldn't traditionally see as children's spaces, I think, is a really big part of that cultural change. Again, getting them in early, actually talking about the money side of it and the complexity of decision making is really important, because until we do that, we won't get the cultural change. So it's providing the tools, the skills, it's demonstrating that it works really effectively. And I've seen some amazing work where you actually see the decision makers experience kind of happening and playing out as they realize that this isn't just kind of a photo opportunity, but actually this is going to improve the way that we make decisions. And so I think the kind of cross-cutting nature of it's really important to me, is we need to get children into any spaces that affect them, which is everywhere, and also that adults have to change the way in which we engage with children and young people. It can't be asking children to come along to committees to give evidence. It's got to be getting out and engaging children in play and in kind of art and ways in which they communicate. And that's actually fun. And once you convince people that that's a legitimate way of spending your time, everyone's going to go choose to be kind of sitting around with the Lego than sitting around a committee table. And so it works. It works, it's effective. And we have to legitimize that engagement with children and young people and say it's okay for adults to be goofy and not take yourself so seriously, and actually engage with children in a way that they communicate. And you'll come up with better results, and you'll have some fun along the way. And I think that's really important as well, is that we legitimize the engagement of children and young people on their terms.
There was a question from James McDougall asking how we can support the use of mechanisms that children choose as opposed to the ones that we would like them to use. And I think that response just responded to that beautifully by saying, we behave a little differently and we ask, perhaps.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, it's the best part of my job, is that generally I do get to spend a lot of time playing with Lego and climbing trees and going camping and things, but it is with a purpose. And I think that adults with the right support figure that out very, very quickly. The really rich information that you get from those types of engagement with children and young people. So we have to kind of really legitimize that. And I think that anytime you try it, it works really effectively. And then you've got another champion and kind of, we've done quite well, I think, with the Scottish Parliament, with members of the Parliament, and getting members of the Parliament out working particularly with younger children, and that's been effective. And so I think that's how you grow a kind of campaign around it.
Bruce, there's a comment in the chat. I I can't quite see who it's from, Jonathan, that just says there's a tension. This goes back to the issue of minimum age for criminal responsibility, and says there's a tension between the argument for recognising children as capable at any age and the age of criminal responsibility debate. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on that. That's also a comment that I think we've heard in Australia about that tension. Is that something you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, and the way that I've always discussed it with decision makers is around kind of protection versus participation rights, and so the idea that right from birth, what we want to recognise as children's ability and right to be involved in decision making and promote that participation, again supported by families and others. But criminalisation is a protection right, and so protecting children from the use of the criminal law to address their behaviour is something that we need to do because we know that it has significant impact on mental and physical health and future life chances. And so that's about protecting rights. It's not to suggest that children aren't capable of being involved in decision making or don't have agency. It doesn't take away from that at all. What it is about protecting children from a state response of using the criminal law to address that behaviour. And saying that a welfare-based response is the appropriate response from the state to address harmful behaviour. But that takes nothing away from children's participation rights and their own agency. Rather, it's what's the appropriate response from the state to harmful behaviour and what protections the rights system needs to provide against that interference by the state. And so I was kind of balanced as saying it's not about you reach a certain age and therefore you become an adult, and it's about participation being from birth and protection being till 18. And I think that's really important in terms of seeing that this is about the state's actions that we're trying to address here and the way in which they address harmful behaviour.
So a question from Jackie, who asks, given your background as a lawyer, she's wondering about your reflections on the approach of the children's hearing system in Scotland versus the more adversarial system in Australia and elsewhere for dealing with child protection matters in particular.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was before I became Commissioner, I was a panel member on the Children's Panel for 13 years. I stood down from that when I became Commissioner, and it's an amazing model, and it's not very well known outside of Scotland. But what was really interesting about it is it was developed in the 1960s, very much as a criminal justice model, but this idea that we would take a welfare-based response to children who were in conflict with the law and those that needed care and protection because their needs were the same. And so that we would have a community-based, welfare-centered approach to it, and that all children would go into that system. It's great in theory, and I think it does work in practice. I'm passionate about the hearing system. It does need reform. I think some of it doesn't always live up to the promise of putting children and young people and their voice at the centre of it. Also, it means that when children, because there's a choice about whether you put a child into that system or the criminal justice system, it means that our criminal justice system is really poor, outside of the hearing system, is really poor at dealing with children that go into the adult system. So effectively, it means that if you're not put into the hearing system, you're in the adult system from a very young age. And so we don't have a youth justice system. And I think that there's benefits to all. The children's hearing system at its best is a really fantastic child-centered welfare-based system, and I think the principles of it are sound. In practice, it needs to improve, particularly children's voices needing to be better heard. And also, speaking as a former panel member, the representation on the panel needs to be different. It does tend to be middle-class, professional, white, middle-aged folk that are sitting on one side of the table, and on the other side of the table, families who can't relate to those people at all, whereas it's supposed to be a community-led system. And so I think there's quite a few changes that need to be made. The benefits of kind of a welfarist approach, I think are very strong, but also a good welfare-based youth justice system can be really effective as well. And again, Andrew Beecroft, the Children's Commissioner in New Zealand, who was previously the Principal Youth Court Judge, is probably a great person to be speaking to about some of those issues and comparing the two. And once, before I became Children's Commissioner, I was having a conversation with him a few years ago in New Zealand, and I was telling him about the children's hearing system, and he asked me a really interesting question. He said to me, do you think that if Scotland was starting with a blank piece of paper now, you could convince people to have the system? And the answer is probably no, but because it was developed back in kind of 60s and 70s, and is very much part of the way of living memory, we're kind of keeping it. But actually, I don't think it represents a kind of radically different view in Scotland in relation to youth justice, to child justice, as opposed to Australia.
There's a question from Angie Bexley. It says her son, who's in year 5 in primary school in Australia, was interested in what's happening in Scotland, and particularly the area of relationships with teachers. And her son wanted to know quite appropriately, I think, whether and how children have been involved in teacher training in Scotland.
Not yet. I'm afraid. And so please say hello to your 10-year-old son if he's not watching. I'm sure he's got better things to do. but yeah, this is something that's come up consistently from the Children's Parliament, which is a centre for excellence on children's participation. And they do have, along with the Youth Parliament, have an annual meeting with Cabinet. But the Children's Parliament's consistently talked about this in terms of the way in which teachers talk to children and kind of relationships, and the idea that kind of getting involved in teacher training. We're not there yet. There's been little bits and pieces, but we're a very long way from children and young people being involved in teacher recruitment, training, kind of ongoing professional development. And I think that's something that we're working on, but it's proving quite challenging because there's quite strongly kind of entrenched professional processes that we're trying to kind of break into. But there's certainly one of the things that we think Incorporation might help with in terms of using the CRC much more strongly to leverage some of that. But I'm glad that your son picked up on that point, because it's something that we're struggling with. So if he's got any ideas, that would be really interesting to hear as well. Get in touch, and maybe he could be in touch with some of the Children's Parliament folk, and they could share some ideas.
We're coming to the end of the time that we've got, and I know people will need to start leaving. But there's a question from Laura Stewart that I think is a fantastic question to end on. And she says, going back to the incorporation of the convention in Scotland, what are your best hopes for how this is going to change the lives of children and young people? And I think ending on a note of hope and optimism is a lovely way to end this conversation.
Right, so it's a brilliant question, and so my hope is that it's going to lead to radical change across every aspect of children's lives, and that what that will look like will be children and young people being actively involved in decision making across Scotland, and taking a rights-based approach to decision making across Scotland, which will lead to really clear improvements on particularly economic, social and cultural rights, particularly around these issues of poverty and mental health that have come through so strongly in my work with children and young people, and also on issues like climate justice, where the leadership of children and young people will be much more recognised. But it's a powerful tool for cultural change and for changing the way in which we see children's relationship with power.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for this webinar. Bruce, it has been such a delight to talk to you, to talk with you. I've learned so much, and it's fantastic to hear what's been happening in Scotland. There were one or two questions that we didn't manage to get to, but I think they're questions that could well be picked up in future conversations. So to those people, please do join us again in the future and raise those questions again. Bruce, for now, thank you so much. Good work with good luck, I should say, with the amazing work that you're doing. I don't think you should feel that any part of what you've done, including the debates around minimum age for criminal responsibility, are a failure. I think it's just part of an important journey that you are leading so many people on. So thank you, and thank you for joining us tonight.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and please do get in touch if anyone's got any other questions. I look forward to the rest of the series.
Thanks so much, Bruce. And to everyone who's joined us, thank you, and take care. Stay safe.